Before I pull you into the heart of my story, a story that will likely fill you with a cold, hard anger, I need you to act. If you believe a woman's worth is not defined by the gender of her children, if you believe a father's love should be unconditional, then please hit that like button and subscribe. Your support is a roar against the silence that allows men like my husband to exist. Now, let me take you to the moment my life was stolen. NTHE verdict wasn't delivered in a courtroom. It was delivered in a nursery. A nursery that had been meticulously designed to house a dynasty. It was painted in deep, regal blues and furnished with dark, heavy mahogany. 10 cribs, each one carved with the family crest, stood empty and waiting. My husband, Alistair, stood in the center of the room, not like a proud father-to-be, but like a king surveying a barren kingdom. He wasn't looking at me, standing in the doorway, my body still aching from the miracle of bringing 10 lives into the world. He was looking at the 10 birth certificates fanned out in his hand. And girl, he read, his voice low and venomous, dropping each certificate to the floor as he named them. Girl, and girl. The last one fluttered to the ground, joining its sisters on the plush carpet. A litter of discarded proofs of my failure. NMY womb was blamed for his pride. 10, he whispered, the word filled with a chilling disbelief. 10 chances, and you couldn't give me one, not one son. Alistair, there are children, I pleaded, my voice trembling. They're beautiful. They're healthy. NHE turned to me then, and the look in his eyes was something I had never seen before. It wasn't anger. It wasn't disappointment. It was a cold, calculating hatred, as if I were a business partner who had just embezzled the entire company fortune. You stole from me, Eleanor, he said, his voice as sharp and cold as shattered glass. You stood in that church and you vowed to honor me, to build a family with me. You knew what the Devereaux name meant. You knew it required an heir. And you brought me this. An ending. NHE took a step towards me, and I flinched. He had never been a physically violent man, but this was a new kind of cruelty, a psychological violence that was more terrifying than any blow. This name, he said, gesturing around the opulent room, has been passed from father to son for 500 years. It has survived wars, plagues, and revolutions, and it ends here, in this estrogen-filled monument to your failure. You didn't bring me children, Eleanor. You brought me the death of my legacy. NHE walked past me, his shoulder brushing mine with deliberate, dismissive force. He didn't storm out. He didn't rage. He walked with the calm, chilling purpose of a man who had already made his decision. I heard him go into his study, the heavy door closing with a soft, final click. A few moments later, I heard the sound of a pen scratching furiously against paper. I was alone in the nursery, surrounded by the 10 empty cribs that were meant for his sons. The silence was deafening. He hadn't just rejected our daughters, he had declared them, and me, the thieves of his future. He had put his pride, his name, his abstract concept of a legacy above the lives of his 10 newborn children. And in that moment, I knew this was not a marriage I could fix. This was a war one had to win, not for my sake, but for the 10 little girls he had already condemned. And I didn't marry a man. I married a legacy. The Devereaux family was not just wealthy, they were an institution. Their lineage traced back to the founding of the country, a long, unbroken line of powerful men, bankers, politicians, industrialists. Their name was etched onto university buildings and museum wings. To marry a Devereaux was to become part of history. And I met Alistair at a charity auction. I was a young art historian, working for the auction house, tasked with explaining the provenance of a Renaissance painting. He wasn't the highest bidder, but he was the most commanding presence in the room. He moved with an aristocratic grace, his posture perfect, his suit impeccably tailored. He had an air of old-world authority that was both intimidating and intoxicating. NHE pursued me with the strategic precision of a corporate takeover. Our dates were less about romance and more about assessment. He inquired about my family background, my education, my health. It felt like a job interview for the role of a lifetime. Mrs. Alistair Devereux III. I knew what was expected. He spoke endlessly of the line, the name, and the continuation. He wasn't just looking for a wife. He was looking for a vessel to carry the next generation of Devereux men. My father was a great man, he told me one evening in his family's cavernous portrait-lined library, but he nearly failed in his most important duty. He had 3 daughters before I was born. He called them his beautiful liabilities. He always said that a man who cannot produce a son has failed his ancestors and betrayed his descendants. It was a chilling philosophy, but I was young and naive. I was swept away by the grandeur, by the promise of a life of security and significance. I saw his obsession not as a flaw, but as a testament to his devotion to his family. I convinced myself that I could be the one to give him everything he wanted. And our wedding was a grand, impersonal affair, a union of his legacy and my potential. I felt like a broodmare being paraded before the elite. The vows felt less like a promise of love and more like the signing of a contract. My part of the bargain was clear: produce a male heir. NTHE pressure began on our honeymoon. Every aspect of our life was geared towards conception: diet, schedules, doctors. There was no passion, only purpose. When I failed to get pregnant in the first year, I was sent to a battery of fertility specialists. It was determined that I had a condition that made conception difficult, but not impossible. Alistair's reaction was not one of sympathy, but of annoyance, as if I were a faulty piece of equipment. NWE embarked on years of grueling fertility treatments. It was a cold, clinical process that reduced the act of love to a series of injections and procedures. Alistair was a detached overseer, his support conditional on the results. Each failed attempt was met with a cold silence, a withdrawal of affection that felt like a punishment. And finally, after years of trying, the doctors had a breakthrough. A new experimental treatment. It was risky, but it had a high success rate. We proceeded. When the doctor called to tell us I was pregnant, Alistair's joy was palpable, but terrifyingly specific. "It's a boy," he declared, a triumphant gleam in his eye. "I know it." The Devereux line continues. Then came the first ultrasound. The technician was silent for a long time, her brow furrowed. She called in a senior doctor. My heart hammered in my chest, certain something was wrong. The doctor looked at the screen, then at me, his face a mask of utter astonishment. "Mrs. Devereux," he said slowly, "you are pregnant." With 10 babies, NTHE number was so staggering, I couldn't comprehend it. 10. But before I could even process the shock, Alistair asked the question that mattered most to him. "Are they boys?" NTHE doctor hesitated. "It's too early to be certain about all of them, but the initial chromosomal markers are unusual. They all appear to be female, NTEN girls." The words sucked the air out of the room. I looked at Alistair. The triumphant gleam in his eyes vanished, replaced by a flicker of pure, cold fury. He composed himself instantly, the mask of aristocratic calm slipping back into place. "The doctor is mistaken," he said, his voice tight. "We will wait for further tests. NBUT. I knew. I felt it in my soul. I was carrying 10 daughters. And I knew, in that sterile, silent room, that I hadn't just conceived 10 children. I had conceived a catastrophe. I had broken the most important clause in my marriage contract. Alistair refused to accept the doctor's findings. He declared it statistical nonsense and preliminary error. He constructed a reality of his own, a fantasy world in which my womb was carrying his 10 sons. He forbade me from speaking to the doctors without him present and insisted on seeking second, third, and fourth opinions, hoping one would give him the answer he wanted. None did. The science was irrefutable. 10 X chromosomes, 10 girls. Faced with a truth he could not change, he chose to deny it. He began a campaign of public deception so audacious it left me breathless. He announced to the world, through a carefully worded press release, that we were expecting decuplets. He spoke of the immense blessing and the future of the Devereaux line. He allowed the media to assume that, among the 10, there would surely be a male heir. He was building a narrative, a grand stage for a triumph he knew would never come. And our life became a carefully managed performance. He hired a public relations team to handle the media frenzy. They crafted an image of us as a devoted, awestruck couple on the verge of a historic family event. I was paraded at charity events, my enormous belly a symbol of his virility and our family's future. I would smile until my face ached, the lie a bitter taste in my mouth. Behind the closed doors of our palatial mansion, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken menace. Alistair treated me not like his wife, but like a volatile investment he was watching with a hawk's eye. He put me on strict bed rest, not for my health, but to control me. He had a team of nurses monitoring me around the clock, their real job to report my every word and action back to him. NHE would spend hours in the nursery he had built, the one with the 10 mahogany cribs. He would talk to my belly, addressing his imaginary sons. "James, you will be the statesman," he'd say, patting one side of my stomach. "Alexander, you will run the empire. William, you will be the artist." He had names and life paths planned for 10 boys, while completely ignoring the 10 real, living girls growing inside me. It was a form of madness, a delusion so profound it was terrifying. NMY, only moments of peace were when I was alone. I would talk to my daughters, my 10 little secrets. I would whisper their names, names I had chosen myself, names that had nothing to do with his dynasty. I named them after virtues and strengths I knew they would need: hope, faith, grace, mercy, joy, patience, serenity, valor, honor, and truth. They were my silent allies in a house full of enemies. NTHE doctors warned of the immense risks. They urged me to consider selective reduction, arguing that carrying 10 babies to term was a danger to my life and theirs. Each time, Alistair refused on my behalf. "Every Devereaux is precious," he would say for the benefit of the doctors, his voice dripping with false piety. But I knew the real reason. To reduce the number would be to admit that the blessing was, in fact, a problem. It would crack the facade of his perfect narrative. He was willing to risk my life, and theirs, for the sake of his pride. NTHE day of the scheduled C-section arrived. The hospital was a fortress, besieged by media. Alistair was in his element, playing the role of the proud, anxious father to perfection. In the operating room, he stood by my head, his hand resting on my shoulder, a gesture that looked like support but felt like a threat. As the surgical team began their work, a hush fell over the room. "First baby is out. It's a girl," the doctor announced. Alistair's hand tightened on my shoulder. "Second baby, a girl." His fingers dug into my skin. "Third, a girl." With each announcement, his grip became more painful, his silence more terrifying. By the time the 10th and final daughter was delivered, his face was a pale, tight mask of fury. NHE didn't look at them. He didn't ask if they were healthy. He simply let go of my shoulder, turned his back on me and our 10 newborn daughters, and walked out of the operating room. The performance was over. The lie had unraveled. And I was left to face the consequences alone. Alistair did not abandon me in the way a normal man would. He did not leave. That would have been a public admission of failure, a stain on the Devereaux name. Instead, he exiled me. When I was discharged from the hospital, I was not brought back to our marital bedroom in the west wing of the mansion. I was escorted by a silent, grim-faced housekeeper to the east wing. This was the part of the house reserved for distant relatives and staff, a series of small, sterile rooms that were a world away from the opulence I was used to. My 10 daughters, in their simple hospital-issued bassinets, were placed in an adjoining room. A team of nurses, hired by Alistair, were assigned to care for them. They were under strict orders. They were to tend to the babies' physical needs, but I was not to be assisted, and I was a prisoner in my own home. Alistair cut me off from everything. My credit cards were canceled. My cell phone was disconnected. The landline in my room could not make outgoing calls. I was forbidden from entering the main part of the house. I was erased from his life, tucked away like a dirty secret. NHE informed the world that I was suffering from a severe case of postpartum psychosis. He was the noble, long-suffering husband, protecting his fragile wife from the pressures of the world while he cared for their challenging new family. It was a masterful, cruel lie that painted him as a saint and me as a madwoman. NMY days were a lonely, exhausting blur. I was solely responsible for the emotional and maternal care of 10 infants. I moved from bassinet to bassinet, feeding, burping, cuddling, and whispering words of love. The nurses watched me with cold, impassive eyes. They were his spies, reporting on my every move. They would change diapers and prepare bottles, but if a baby was crying, they would look to me, their expressions making it clear that soothing was my job and my failure alone. Alistair never visited. He never once came to the East Wing to see his daughters. In his mind, they did not exist. They were the tangible evidence of my betrayal, and he had locked them away with me. His pride was so absolute that he would rather pretend he was childless than acknowledge he was the father of 10 girls. NMY only human contact, besides the silent nurses, was with his lawyer, a cold, reptilian man named Mr. Davies. He visited me once a week. He would not sit. He would stand in the doorway of my small room and deliver Alistair's terms. "Alistair is prepared to be generous, Eleanor," he said one afternoon, his voice devoid of any warmth. "He will provide for you and the children for the rest of your lives. You will have everything you need here in this wing. In return, you will sign a new post-nuptial agreement. It will grant him a divorce on the grounds of your mental incompetence. You will relinquish all claims to the Devereux estate, and you will agree to never speak of him or this family to anyone, ever again. You will, in essence, cease to exist." It was a life sentence. A comfortable, gilded cage where I would be allowed to raise my daughters in obscurity, their existence a secret, their father a ghost. And if I refuse? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. NMR. Davies allowed himself a small, cruel smile. "Then he will have you declared legally insane. He has the best doctors in the country on retainer, all willing to testify to your condition. He will take the children, place them in the care of a trust, and you will be committed to a private institution. You will never see them again. The choice is yours, Eleanor. A quiet life of obscurity, or no life at all." NHE left the documents on the small table by the door. I looked at the thick stack of paper, my death warrant. Then I looked at the 10 tiny, sleeping faces in the next room. He thought he had trapped me. He thought he had won. But he had made a critical error. He had left me with my daughters, and as long as I had them, I had 10 reasons to fight. He had underestimated the fury of a mother whose children had been condemned. Alistair believed that money could buy anything: loyalty, silence, complicity. He was wrong. He had hired a team of 12 nurses to work in shifts, believing their professional detachment and his generous paychecks would ensure their allegiance. He failed to account for their humanity. Most of the nurses were just as he expected: cold, efficient, and loyal to the man who signed their checks. They followed their orders to the letter, treating me like a psychiatric patient and the babies like tasks to be completed. But there were 2 who were different. NTHE first was Agnes, a woman in her late 60s, a veteran nurse from Ireland with kind, weary eyes that had seen everything. She was quiet, but I would see her watching me, a flicker of sympathy in her gaze as I struggled to soothe 3 crying babies at once. She would, in small, almost imperceptible ways, defy her orders. She would leave a cup of tea for me, still warm. She would accidentally leave a medical journal open to an article on infant sleep patterns. They were tiny acts of kindness, drops of water in a vast desert. NTHE second was Maria, a young, fiery nurse from the Philippines. She had children of her own back home, and she looked at Alistair's cruelty with a barely concealed rage. She was less subtle than Agnes. "This is wrong," she muttered to me one night, as she helped me change a particularly fussy baby, Hope. "In my country, children are a blessing from God. Any children. To do this, it is a sin," and I was terrified to trust them. A single misplaced word could lead to my ruin. But as the weeks wore on, their small acts of rebellion became bolder. Agnes would forget to log a detail in her report, like the fact that I had been weeping from exhaustion. Maria would secretly rock a baby to sleep to give me a few minutes of rest, something she was explicitly forbidden from doing. NTHE turning point came one night when little Serenity developed a cough. It quickly worsened, her breathing becoming shallow and ragged. I knew she needed a doctor. I buzzed for the head nurse, the coldest of them all, and begged her to call a pediatrician. She refused. "Mr. Devereaux's orders are clear," she said, her voice flat. "No outside contact. It is a simple cough. She will be fine." Panic seized me. I could hear Serenity struggling to breathe. I pleaded. I screamed. I wept. The head nurse simply turned and walked away, threatening to have me sedated if I continued my hysteria. I was alone, watching my baby suffer. A few minutes later, Agnes and Maria slipped into my room. Their faces were grim. "She is right," Agnes whispered, her Irish brogue thick with anger. "We cannot call a doctor. But we are not going to let this baby die." What followed was a conspiracy born of compassion. Maria, who had some pediatric respiratory training, created a makeshift steam tent over Serenity's bassinet. Agnes used her knowledge of herbal remedies, passed down from her grandmother, to make a soothing poultice for the baby's chest. For hours, the three of us worked together, a secret team of mothers fighting for a child's life. NBY dawn, Serenity's breathing had eased. Her fever had broken. She was sleeping peacefully. Agnes and Maria had saved her life. They had risked their jobs, their livelihoods, to defy a cruel man's orders. "We cannot let this continue, Eleanor," Agnes said, her face set with a new resolve. "This is not just imprisonment. This is endangerment. We have to get you out of here." Maria nodded, her eyes flashing. "I have a cousin who works for a human rights organization. They have lawyers. They specialize in helping people who are trapped, people with no voice. But we need more than your word against his. We need proof, hard proof of what he is doing to you." NTHE next day, Maria smuggled in a tiny, button-sized recording device. "Be careful," she whispered, pressing it into my palm. "He is a monster, but monsters can be slain." NTHE small, cold piece of metal in my hand felt like a sword. The conspiracy of nurses had given me a weapon, and I was going to use it to tear down the walls of my prison. NTHE recording device became my secret weapon, a tiny, silent witness to my captivity. The challenge was using it. Alistair never spoke to me, and his lawyer, Mr. Davies, was too cautious to say anything incriminating. I needed to force their hand. I needed to create a confrontation. NMY opportunity came during Mr. Davies' next weekly visit. I refused to sign the papers he had left for me. I told him I wanted to speak to my husband. Davies was annoyed, but he relayed the message. A few hours later, for the first time in months, Alistair entered the East Wing. NHE stood in the doorway, his presence filling the small room with a cold, oppressive energy. He looked at me with utter contempt. The button-sized recorder was clipped to the collar of my simple dress, hidden in a fold of fabric. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. "What is this, Eleanor?" he asked, his voice dangerously calm. "A last pathetic attempt at negotiation?" "I assure you, the terms are not negotiable." "I don't want to negotiate, Alistair," I said, my voice shaking but clear. "I want to understand." I want you to look at me and tell me why you are doing this." "I have already told you," he sneered. "You have failed. You have broken our contract." "That was not a contract," I said, my voice gaining strength. "That was a marriage vow. I vowed to love and honor you. I have given you 10 beautiful children, and you have locked us away as if we are a shameful disease." "They are your daughters, Alistair. They are not my daughters," he finally roared, his composure cracking. The sound was shocking in the quiet wing. "They are a genetic dead end. They are a mockery of my name. I will not have my legacy diluted and destroyed by a brood of females who will marry and cast the Devereaux name aside like a piece of trash. So you would rather they didn't exist at all?" I pressed, my heart aching but my mind focused. "You would rather let them die than carry your name? What about Serenity?" "She was sick, Alistair. She almost died because you forbade the nurses from calling a doctor." And a flicker of something, annoyance, surprise, crossed his face. "The nurses are paid to follow orders. Her health is your responsibility. If you are too incompetent to manage a simple cough, it only proves my point about your mental state." It was a confession, a cold, callous admission of his depraved indifference. I had it. I had the proof. "I will not sign your papers, Alistair," I said, my voice now steady and cold. "I will not disappear. These are my children, and I will protect them from you." NHI's face twisted into a mask of pure fury. "You foolish woman," he hissed. "You have nothing. You are nothing without me. I will crush you. I will have you committed, and you will spend the rest of your life rotting in a padded room, and your precious daughters will be raised by strangers. They will never even know your name. That is my legacy to you." NHE turned and stormed out. I collapsed onto the bed, shaking, but clutching the recording device like a holy relic. I had his threats, his confession, his cruelty, all captured in that tiny piece of technology. NTHAT, night. Agnes helped me. She smuggled the device out of the mansion and delivered it to Maria's cousin at the Human Rights Organization. The war had begun. A team of lawyers, working pro bono, listened to the recording. They were horrified. They immediately began drafting an emergency petition to the court, a legal bombshell built on Alistair's own words. A week later, as Alistair was hosting a lavish charity gala in the main ballroom of the mansion, a team of plainclothes police officers and social workers arrived at the front gate. They presented a warrant, signed by a family court judge, granting them immediate access to the premises and giving me temporary emergency custody of my 10 daughters. NTHE look on Alistair's face when he was served. The papers in the middle of his party, in front of hundreds of the city's elite, was something I would never forget. It was the look of a king whose castle walls had just been breached. His carefully constructed world of lies and power was beginning to crumble. And I had been the one to light the fuse. NTHE court battle was not a battle. It was an execution. Alistair and his high-priced legal team came prepared for a typical divorce proceeding, ready to sling mud and question my sanity. They were not prepared for the atomic bomb of his own words. NTHE courtroom was packed. The story had exploded in the media, but the details were still sealed. Alistair sat at his table, the picture of wronged aristocracy, his jaw set, his eyes cold. He believed this was a temporary inconvenience, a problem his money could solve. NTHE judge, a sharp, intelligent woman named Judge Carol Diaz, listened impassively as Alistair's lawyer began his opening statement, painting me as a delusional and unstable woman. Then, it was our turn. Our lawyer, a brilliant and passionate woman named Evelyn Reed, stood up. "And Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and strong, "we believe the best person to speak to Mr. Devereaux's character is Mr. Devereaux himself." NSHE played the recording. NTHE courtroom fell into a stunned, horrified silence. Alistair's voice, filled with venom and rage, echoed through the speakers. The jury, the reporters, everyone in the room heard him call his children a genetic dead end, They heard him admit to denying a sick infant medical care. They heard him threaten to have me locked away forever. They heard him, in his own words, place his name and his pride above the lives and well-being of his 10 daughters. Nalister went pale, his aristocratic composure shattering into a million pieces. He looked at his lawyer in a panic, but the man could only stare down at his legal pad, his face ashen. There is no defense against a man's own soul, laid bare for the world to hear. Agnes and Maria testified next. They spoke of the conditions in the East Wing, of my devotion to my children, and of Alistair's cruel, calculated neglect. They corroborated the story of Serenity's illness, their testimony unshakable, and the verdict was swift and brutal. Judge Diaz looked at Alistair with an expression of profound disgust. "Mr. Devereux," she said, her voice like ice, "you speak of legacy. A legacy is not built on a name, but on character. It is not something you inherit, it is something you earn. You have proven yourself to have no character. You are a hollow man, a disgrace to the title of father. NSHE granted me a divorce and sole absolute custody of our 10 daughters. She stripped him of any and all parental rights. He was forbidden from ever contacting them or coming near them again. But she didn't stop there. She ordered a full financial investigation into the Devereux estate, placing his assets in a trust to be administered by the court, ensuring that the vast majority of his fortune would be used for the care and upbringing of the 10 children he had discarded. She effectively seized his legacy and handed it to the daughters he had despised. Finally, she announced that she was turning over the evidence from the case to the district attorney's office, with a recommendation for criminal charges of child endangerment and unlawful imprisonment. The fall of the House of Devereux was complete. It had been brought down not by a rival corporation or a political enemy, but by the love of a mother and the courage of 2 nurses. As I walked out of the courtroom, surrounded by my legal team and a new group of supporters, I felt the weight of the Devereux name fall from my shoulders. I was no longer Eleanor Devereux, the failed wife. I was Eleanor Vance, my maiden name, a mother of 10, and I was finally free. And NWE did not want the Devereux money, but we took it. We took it not as a prize, but as reparations. It was the price of his cruelty, the stolen inheritance of his daughters. But we would not use it to live a life of opulence. We would use it to build a new legacy. With the help of Evelyn Reed and a team of financial advisors, I established the 10 Sisters Foundation, a charitable organization dedicated to funding causes that were the antithesis of everything Alistair stood for. We funded scholarships for women in business and science. We supported organizations that provided legal aid to victims of domestic abuse. We built shelters for homeless families. We used the Devereux fortune to dismantle the very patriarchal systems that Alistair held so dear. His name, once etched on museum wings, was now attached to women's shelters and girls' leadership programs. It was the ultimate poetic justice. I moved my daughters far away from the city and its toxic memories. We bought a large, rambling house in the countryside, a place with gardens to run in and trees to climb. It was a home filled not with the weight of history, but with the sound of laughter. It was chaotic, messy, and wonderful. NMY daughters grew into 10 extraordinary young women. Freed from the shadow of their father's expectations, they were able to become whoever they wanted to be. Hope became a human rights lawyer, fighting for the voiceless. Faith became an investigative journalist, exposing corruption. Grace became a doctor who worked in underserved communities. Each one of them, in her own way, dedicated her life to making the world a better, fairer place. They were my legacy. A legacy of compassion, strength, and resilience, multiplied by 10 Alistair. He was convicted of the criminal charges and served a short, comfortable sentence in a minimum security prison. He was released a broken man, his name a punchline, his fortune gone. He lived out the rest of his days in obscurity, a lonely old man in a small apartment, haunted by the ghosts of the sons he never had and the 10 remarkable daughters he had thrown away. One evening, years later, I was sitting on the porch of our home, watching my daughters, now grown women, gathered in the yard with their own families. My grandchildren, boys and girls, ran through the grass, their laughter filling the air. My oldest, Valor, came and sat beside me. "Mom," she said, her eyes sweeping over the happy scene, "do you ever think about him? About the legacy he was so obsessed with?" And I thought for a moment, watching my granddaughter teach her little brother how to catch a firefly. I looked at the vibrant, loving family that had grown from the ashes of so much pain. His legacy was a name on a building. I said softly. It was a story in a history book. It was cold and it was empty. This, I said, gesturing to the beautiful, chaotic, love-filled scene before us, is a living legacy. He thought I stole his. He had no idea that he was the one who gave me the power to create a real one, and in that moment, surrounded by the proof of a life well lived, I knew it was true. He had tried to bury me, to erase me. But he had forgotten one crucial thing. A legacy isn't about the name you carry, it's about the love you leave behind. And ours was just beginning.